Good evening, everyone. We're going to start the meeting now. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is the 7th installment in our lecture series of Contra versus Corona. Some of you will be familiar with the series and others might be new. So welcome along and thanks for coming. This came about as well as a public health emergency. COVID-19 has created, as I'm sure we're all aware, deep economic, political and social crises. So in response, Contra organised this series of talks to explore these issues in depth. And we've had lectures on the economy, globalisation, geopolitics, imperialism, class, intersecting oppressions, and how the left should organise to win power. There's more lectures to come. We have David Harvey next week, and those from previous weeks are on our website at contour.co.uk. On Tuesday, we held an online rally, and 300 people came along to hear directly from organisers in Minneapolis and Jackson, Mississippi, as well as Amr Anwar, the civil rights lawyer for the family of Sheku Bayo, who died in police custody in Scotland in 2015. There's a lot of information being shared at the moment and many organisations to donate to, but the ones that Contours are highlighting are Black Visions and Organise the Block, both based in Minneapolis. And closer to home, you can follow and support the Sheku Bayo Justice Campaign, which you can find on Twitter and Facebook. So today we are very lucky to have Professor Alfredo Saad-Filho with us to present his latest research and talk on authoritarianism under neoliberalism. I'll introduce Alfredo in just a few moments. So before that, I'll run through a few things. So firstly, I'm going to be your facilitator tonight. My name is Alice. I am a socialist based in Edinburgh. The structure of the meeting is going to go as follows. Alfredo is going to speak for around 30 minutes. After that, we'll break out into smaller groups for 15 minutes using the Zoom breakout function to discuss the talk and collectively come up with more questions, one question per group. We'll then come back to the main session and have a Q&A until 7:30 p.m. A few housekeeping details. Your microphone must be on mute at all times. This reduces the problem of feedback and means everyone will have a better experience. Many of you will probably have heard about people disrupting Zoom meetings. Alfredo has his own experiences and stories of this. So we've taken a number of precautions to prevent this, and we have a security team on hand to eject anyone from the meeting if necessary. I have now the great pleasure of introducing our speaker. So Professor Alfredo Saad-Filho is a world-renowned Marxist political economist and author. His work includes Brazil, Neoliberalism versus Democracy and Marxist Capital, which you will then find. He was previously a senior economist at UNCTAD and a professor of development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's currently the professor of political economy and international development at King's College London. And you can find Alfredo on Twitter at @Saad-Filho. So over to you, Alfredo. Thank you. Alfredo, if you could unmute.
That helps, doesn't it? So apologies for that. Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks to Conta for the invitation, and thanks also for their support, including the publication of my blog piece on the site. Can you correctly see my initial slide with the title of the session? Okay, good. So what I'm going to do is to talk to you about my current work on the three most visible crises today: the economic crisis, the political crisis, and the health crisis. And I'll suggest to you that these are all crises in neoliberalism, and that they are morphing into a generalized crisis of neoliberalism. And we can see inklings of this perfect storm in the United States and in Brazil, and we can see it in other countries too in different ways. But to understand them and the relationships between them and the prospects and the possibilities for left intervention, I will start with neoliberalism itself. So, my first point is that we live in the age of neoliberalism. And this is not just about ideas or policies. Neoliberalism is the current stage or phase or mode of existence of global capitalism. Neoliberalism emerged at the end of the post-war boom, and it spread from the UK and the US through Atlanticism and the Washington Consensus. And the most significant feature of neoliberalism is financialization, meaning the subordination of economic and social reproduction to what Marx called interest-bearing capital. Now, the core of financialization today is the transfer of state capacity to allocate resources onto a globally integrated financial system dominated by US institutions. And this allowed finance to control the main sources of capital and the levers of economic policy, and it facilitated the reconstitution of the US empire after the defeats in Vietnam and in Iran and the dollar crisis in the 1970s. So neoliberalism facilitated an extraordinary recovery of profitability since the lows of the early 1980s, but financialization also and inevitably fueled a vast sphere of speculation, and finance has been appropriating a growing share of the total value produced in the economy. Now, the next feature of neoliberalism that is important for us is the transnationalization of production and finance that became known in common discourse as globalization. And this is about the international integration of individual circuits of capital at the level of firms. And then to support it, the liberalization of trade, of domestic finance, and of international capital flows. Next is the financialization of the state. And this is important because it is the state that imposes and legitimizes neoliberalism. It transfers to finance the control over the sources of capital. It introduces the new legal framework. It puts together the new industrial and financial structure. The state privatizes public assets, commercializes services, withdraws social security, imposes means-tested benefits, enforces private sector performance indicators on public institutions, and of course, it represses the opposition. And ideologically, neoliberalism is justified through a discourse based on two notions. The notion of competitiveness in the short-termist sense that is associated with the financial markets, and the notion of democracy, but in a narrow sense of competition between shades of neoliberalism in a political market. Now, neoliberalism transformed social reproduction and it imposed discipline. It did this through the expansion of capitalism throughout the global south and what existed before as the Soviet bloc and their integration into global circuits, which increased competition between and within working classes. It did that through technological innovations, new patterns of employment, and restrictions to the wages, subsidies, benefits, entitlement systems, and all sorts of other non-market protections. They together compressed real incomes and also opened spaces for some countries to sustain rapid growth, particularly in East Asia, with China becoming the assembly hub of the world. Neoliberalism imposed discipline through permanently contractionary fiscal and monetary policies, and the workers became increasingly tangled up in financial circuits through their overdrafts, their credit cards, their mortgages, pensions, and then payments for education, for health, and for a whole range of areas of social provision, often financed by loans. And pressure for loan repayment increasingly pushed people to accept long hours in multiple jobs with flexible contracts in very stressful conditions. Now, neoliberalism restored profitability, as I said, but it also fueled inequality, and it led to declining investment and GDP growth rates, despite the unprecedentedly favorable conditions for accumulation. The West won the Cold War. There was liberalization of trade and finance and capital movements. There's unparalleled support for accumulation by competing states. There's cuts in taxes. in transfers and in welfare provision or benefiting profits. There's the decline of all the traditional sources of resistance, nationalist movements and governments, trade unions, peasant movements, left political parties, you name it. And there's the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism. But shockingly, instead of thriving under these ideal conditions, accumulation in the core countries has been slowing down decade on decade. And between 2007 and 2020, the West suffered the longest calamity and the weakest and most regressive recovery on record until now. So what I call the economic paradox of neoliberalism is that the delivery of extraordinarily favorable conditions for accumulation has been associated with a complete inability of the system to capitalize on them. Sorry, let me get back one slide. So you see that an unmistakable trend towards declining GDP growth rates in the world as a whole and in the OECD countries over time. And if you disaggregate, of course, you're going to see a similar tendency for every country, at least within the OECD. In the Global South, the picture is slightly different. Now, historically, neoliberalism has been through three periods or three phases that are kind of loosely divided by the mid-1990s and then by the global crisis. The first period is the transition phase or the shock phase that sees the aggressive promotion of private capital with very little regard for the consequences to make neoliberalism an established fact on the ground. And this transition always requires forceful state intervention to contain labor, to destroy the left, to promote the transnational integration of domestic capital and finance, and to put in place the new institutional framework. And this it can be seen through the military coups in Uruguay, in Chile, and Argentina in the 1970s. It can be seen through Thatcherism and Reaganism and their offspring in the advanced economies, and then structural adjustment in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa since the 1980s, and the transitions in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And this phase closes with the East Asian crisis and the transitions to neoliberalism in that region in the mid-90s. Then we have the second, the mature or the third wayist phase of neoliberalism. Think now Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And this is a phase where you secure and expand the hegemony of finance in economic and social reproduction. This is now about state management of the new modalities of international integration. This is about rolling out neoliberal social policies to manage the deprivations that have been created in the previous phase of transition. And it's about the consolidation of neoliberal subjectivities through the colonization of the mind. So neoliberalism is not just a fact on the ground, it's a fact inside ourselves as well. At that point, there is no more space for the traditional left, both because society had changed and because most people didn't believe in it anymore. And after the global crisis, we have a third period that is distinguished by the loss of legitimacy that followed the shock and realization of the astronomical cost of saving finance, the perception that neoliberalism had concentrated income and concentrated wealth, and it had imposed very unpopular patterns of employment, and that neoliberalism had failed to deliver rapid and stable accumulation. So if you look at the distributional picture, this makes all of this very, very clear. This is the U-shaped graph that became very famous with Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, that came out in 2013, became a hit, showing that Piketty captured the moment. And for the Anglo-Saxon countries, the picture is uniform, very high concentration of income in the early years of the 20th century. This is the graph showing the top percentile in the total distribution of income. And then distribution of income becomes much more equal in the years after the Second World War, the golden years of Keynesianism and social democracy. And then with neoliberalism, the distribution of income deteriorates again. And if we look at the United States is very convenient. It's the biggest capitalist economy, and you have the best data for it as well. The wage share of national income in the United States declines during almost the entire neoliberal period. The trend is very, very clear. It is also very, very clear that if you look at productivity growth, the top blue line here, that productivity growth in the United States is remarkably stable. It's about 2.5% per year since the end of the Second World War. And productivity continues to grow from the Keynesian period into the neoliberal period. What changes is wages. Real wages in the United States, hourly wages, the bottom green line here, are basically stagnant since about 1973. You see, the middle line here is household income. How is it that household income has been rising a little bit if wages are constant? It's because people are working more hours. That is, women going from the kitchen to the workforce. It is retired people coming back into the workforce. It is students working. So there's more hours being worked at the same wages. And that is what explains this figure that we have here. Now, if productivity is rising but wages are not, who is capturing all this wealth, all this income generated here in the middle? If it's not wages, clearly it has to be capital. Now, if you disaggregate incomes, what you see is that if the highest your income is, the more you have gained in the neoliberal period. And the lower your income is, the more stagnant it has been. It's an unambiguous picture of concentration of income. If you have, you will have more. If you don't have, you will not have any more than you already have. Another way to look at this picture of growing inequality is to see education levels. And again, for the United States, the more years of education you have, the higher your income rises over time. And the less years of education you've got, the more your hourly real income declines over time. So it's a picture again of those who have earning more and more, and those who have very little having their wages compressed over time. This is the picture of neoliberalism. If you plot the distribution of income as a whole, this is the picture that you see. If you're at the top of the distribution, you earn more income. If you are at the bottom of the distribution, you earn less. Your income is compressed. And this is after the crisis, but the picture will be the same if you stretch it back to 1973 or to 1961. This is now the picture for Chile. The years of Pinochet in Chile, it's exactly the same picture that you see for the United States. And I could show you data for Mexico, I could show you data for other countries, it would be exactly the same picture. What is, then the question is, what is the process that is generating those distributional outcomes? Now, we saw that neoliberalism restructured economies very deeply, and this process created a large army of what I call economic losers under neoliberalism. Millions of skilled jobs were eliminated, particularly in the advanced economies. Entire professions vanished or they were exported. Employment opportunities in the public sector worsened because of privatization and because of retrenching of the state. Job stability declined everywhere, and pay and conditions and welfare tended to deteriorate. The informal workers tended to lose their prospects of stable employment, and the skilled workers were living in fear of the export of their jobs, and both had to bear the stress of overwork. And it was similar with an economically privileged, but still indebted, impoverished, anxious, and increasingly vulnerable middle class and professional class. And in the advanced economies, those losers, they are concentrated amongst the skilled working class and the poor underneath them, which makes it easy then for analysts to say, well, neoliberalism is about class war. This is, of course, not wrong, but then every form of capitalism is about class war and it's about modes of exploitation. But neoliberalism is about more than this. Financialization, globalization, new technologies, economic restructuring, they are tools for the extraction of value from the workers. They are also tools of social control. We could have a whole session to talk about this, but perhaps not right now. So, what we, what we then get tendentially is a picture of growing inequality. The top photograph is Sao Paulo, a photograph taken in Sao Paulo in Brazil. The bottom photograph is in Cape Town in South Africa. That is where neoliberalism takes you if you let it run free. This will be the outcome. So then we find that neoliberalism, accumulation under neoliberalism, tends to take the form of bubbles that inevitably collapse with destructive implications and that always require a state-sponsored bailout. So think international debt crisis 1982, savings and loans crisis in the United States in the late 80s, stock market crash in 1987, crisis in Mexico in 94, crisis in East Asia, 96, 97, in Russia, 98, Brazil, 99, Argentina, 2001, .com. In the United States, then the Fed kept the federal funds rate low after the collapse of the .com bubble and after 9/11. And then given stagnant wages, this led to an enormous bubble of consumer credit and a huge episode of financial speculation that culminated in a real estate bubble. By September 2008, after many signs of crisis going back to the previous year, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and that triggered the great financial crisis. Credit markets froze, equity prices collapsed, leading financial institutions across the board were technically bankrupt, and many of them turned to governments for support. And the measures that were taken to deal with the crisis demonstrated very clearly the hegemony of finance over public policy. In essence, what happened was that central banks cut interest rates to zero, and they created unlimited amounts of money to buy worthless financial assets owned by the banks in order to bail out the financial sector, with the argument that there would be an even worse crisis if they didn't do that. But this socialization of losses without any restructuring of finance, that is what allowed neoliberalism to preserve itself. And if under the pressure of the crisis, everybody always becomes a Keynesian, then the neoliberal ideologues try to come back as soon as possible after that. They said that the fiscal disequilibria that had been created by saving the banks would require fiscal austerity to address. That means even more neoliberalism in even more rollback of the welfare state to expand even more the control of finance over resources and over society as a whole. So since 2007 and until 2015, the debt of the financial corporations around the world increased by $12 trillion. Public sector debt increased by $25 trillion, of which 20 trillion in 8 OECD countries. And the liabilities of households increased by $7 trillion. It's a recovery, or it was a recovery based on the accumulation of even more debt. Now, let me pause with economics and move to politics. There is a variety of paths of transition to neoliberalism, and these can be more authoritarian, Pinochet or Videla or Thatcher or Reagan, or they can be linked to democratic transitions. Think Brazil or South Africa, South Korea, Eastern Europe. There are then different paths, and through these different paths, a typical democratic political form became associated with neoliberalism in the 1990s. These were neoliberal democracies as the typical political form of that age. And those neoliberal democracies were heavily circumscribed. In particular, they had an institutional apparatus that was designed to lock in neoliberalism and to insulate economic policy from interference by the majority. You have ministries of finance dominated by neoliberal policymakers. You have so-called independent central banks that are captured by finance and legally bound to deliver inflation targets, but also to rescue feckless financial institutions. You have treasury departments constrained by legal ceilings on fiscal deficits, except when they have to transfer unlimited resources to finance. You have floating exchange rate regimes to constrain governments to have to follow the traders. You have privatized utilities that are then bought by transnational hedge funds. You have regulatory agencies that are captured by the conglomerates that should be under their authority. And those structures, what they did was to disable the policy-making capacity of neoliberal states, and they reduced the policy space for nominally democratic states. And with it, they reduced the space for legitimate opposition. So there was no alternative, there was no choice, and so there was no debate around the economy. Instead, the political space was taken up by culture, and then religion, and then nationalism, and then racism. And this process compounded the alienation of the economic losers that I mentioned before. They were still unhappy, but with the destruction of the left, they were then ignored, feeding alienation and anger, and then they were polarized by ethical conflicts between good and bad. No, there's no class politics. Polarization by ethical conflicts between good people and bad people, insider-outsider conflicts fueled by the mainstream media and grounded and validated by common sense. So it becomes obvious that immigrants are thieves and they will take your wallet and they will take your house. That's obvious that women and gays and ethnic minorities, they're taking up our rights because it's obvious that there's a fixed amount of rights. And if the state gives those rights to some people, then I've lost my job and I'm no longer even allowed to make a racist joke or a sexist joke. There must be a connection between these things. And we know what the connection is politically correct bullshit that the experts give us. And they are also the same experts that impose the metric system on our proud imperial country. And now we can't even buy wonky bananas because the EU won't allow us to do that. And if our fishing communities are suffering and are good and they're honest and they're hardworking people, it's obvious that our country was tricked and our politicians are fools, except no, they're not fools. Look at all the wealth in London. This is a conspiracy. This is a conspiracy. And it's obvious that China is stealing our jobs. Look at my manufacturing job. Where's my job now? And it's obvious that politicians do nothing, and they can't do nothing. They can't do anything because they've accepted the institutions of neoliberalism as they are. So obviously politicians are both useless and corrupt, and you might as well not vote, or you might vote for the crank, you might vote for the clown, you might vote for the outsider who at least has got the guts to tell the truth. So what I am suggesting, and this is me back again, what I am suggesting is that in contemporary neoliberalism, the collectivity of the working class has been demolished, class politics has been defeated, and democracy has been eviscerated. And the losers are now driven to frame their disappointments, resentments, fears, hopes through the prism of an individualist and commonsensical ethical conflict, and through the lens of undue privilege that is given by the state to the undeserving poor, to minorities, to foreigners, and to foreign countries. So the political paradox of neoliberalism is that the institutionalization of a neoliberal democracy undermined the foundations of democracy itself. The structures of representation became unresponsive, public policy became indifferent to the majority, the state signaled that class-based collectivities would not be recognized, and that cash-poor individuals were either failures or they were crooks. But at the same time, the economic limitations of neoliberalism that we talked about before, they implied that legitimate material aspirations would not be satisfied, and that the next generation would not do as well as their parents did. And this breaks a generational contract that had helped to validate capitalism since the 18th century. And this is the first time that this contract has been broken. So in the end, it is each person for themselves, except for the perception that minority groups were either being given or were taking what did not belong to them. And this is a combustible situation. And so here we are, except that we're not there yet. Though what those circumstances did was to open spaces for anti-systemic forces that were polarized by what I call spectacular authoritarian leaders. These are strong men, and are almost always men, that cultivate a politics of resentment by appealing to common sense, by appearing to talk honestly, by claiming to be able to get things done by force of will, often claiming credentials because of their business acumen, and then promising to use their strength of character and their outsider status to come in and then confront the neoliberal state in finance and globalization and the elites, the experts, the entrenched interests, the corrupt politicians, the selfish civil servants that capture the institutions, the foreigners, everybody else. And then all these people who are undermining our nation and harming our people, and they do this to attract the support from the losers. But when they are in power, those spectacular leaders, they invariably enforce policies leading to the intensification of neoliberalism, but now under the veil of nationalism and a more or less explicit racism. So what I'm suggesting is that this is not a blip. What we have is a systemic political crisis in neoliberalism, where the rise of authoritarian leaders is a symptom of the decomposition of neoliberal democracy. It is the outcome of the crises of restructured neoliberal economies, political systems, institutions of representations, and it is evidence of the hijacking of mass discontent by the far right. And what nationalism and racism do in this context is to offer the people a way to respond to real, actual injuries and to restore a sense of collectivity that was lost everywhere else and to reaffirm their worth that neoliberalism denies in every other field. So the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism is a reflex of a desperate search by the losers for ways to short-circuit a political system that has become unquestionably jammed into secure gains for people who have become tired of losing out to undeserving others. But by now, to their right stand even more dangerous movements claiming greater political coherence and wanting to represent the losers in even more aggressive ways. The paradox of authoritarian neoliberalism, to me, is that the economic and political crises of neoliberalism promote the personification of politics and the rise of spectacular leaders untethered by stabilizing intermediary institutions, party structures, trade unions, social movements, the law, etc. Those leaders are committed to neoliberalism and to their own personal power. And when they are in power, they promote the expansion of neoliberalism and attack all forms of opposition, giving even more power to the neoliberal elites. But those policies harm their own political base. Society becomes increasingly divided, wages decline, taxes become more regressive, social protections are eroded, economies become even more unbalanced, poverty grows. Mass frustration intensifies, and that feeds an unfocused discontent, which the leaders must then navigate by creating even more resentments and more conflicts. They cannot stop, or their popularity declines because they cannot resolve actual problems. They can only perform. So look at Trump, look at Boris Johnson, look at Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So my claim is that authoritarian neoliberalism is intrinsically unstable, and its dynamics will offer increasing scope for the far right, and perhaps unintentionally will foment modern forms of fascism. So now we get to the pandemic, and what the pandemic did was to intensify those contradictions. The economy wasn't growing, and now it has fallen off a cliff. We have the sharpest and the deepest economic contraction in the history of capitalism. Now, the disintegration of the global economy left the most uncompromising wealthy neoliberal economies, the UK and the USA, exposed as being completely unable to produce enough face masks, enough personal protective equipment, enough ventilators for their hospitals and for their population. And those insufficiencies, they were designed by policy. 4 decades of neoliberalism depleted state capacities in the name of the efficiency of the market. They promoted deindustrialization through the globalization of production. They promoted the pursuit of short-term profitability. They built fragile financial structures that was secured only by magical thinking and by state guarantees. With the pandemic, capital was sheltered everywhere, but the losers lost jobs, incomes, they lost businesses, they lost credit lines. 40 million posts plus lost in the United States, and in the UK, the government is very clear that the furlough scheme cannot last much longer. So we were already seeing a gradual disintegration of democracy and an emerging authoritarianism. Now we have highly authoritarian governments claiming the right to control our movements for our own good, claiming the legitimacy to intercept communications, to cross-check contacts and health status, to deploy the military to control civilians. It's only their incompetence that makes those governments stumble. But we can't rely on their stupidity forever. So we had flexible labor markets. Those markets will become even more flexible as economies re-emerge. We know by now of people being rehired with even worse contracts than before for the same jobs, and it's worse beneath the surface. Immediately as the pandemic struck, the Fed, the Bank of England, the ECB shifted to a new form of monetary policy where they directly validate fictitious capital from private companies. So the state is now closing circuits of capital and delivering surplus value extracted somewhere. The shame is gone. The shame is gone. So we are not going back to normal. The default is that we're going somewhere much worse than where we were before. We will experience capitalism with new crises and without prosperity. There was talk of a V-shaped recovery that became U-shaped and then W-shaped, and now it's L-shaped because there will be no significant economic dynamism after the initial bounce back. We've had 1 decade of austerity, and now we're being told that there must be another 2 or 3 decades of even greater deprivation while the billionaires accumulate greater fortunes. And this is stretching the hegemony of neoliberalism. Economically, austerity makes no sense at all. And ideologically, pushing for a new wave of austerity is like you remember the coyote in that cartoon that's running on air. You can force it because you own the state, but there's no support for this. And these economic and these political predicaments raise questions then about the stability of neoliberalism and about the viability of capitalism itself. But they also point to a decisive push towards authoritarianism by governments that are now devoid of support, of legitimacy, of viable policies, of inspiration, and devoid of hope to offer their populations. Let me finish on this. It's very clear that the tendency is for economic stagnation and for the emergence of new forms of fascism, and the counter tendency is for a resurgence of the left. But on this, I think the focus can be on stressing the definitional features of the left, the concerns with equality, with collectivity, and with economic and political democracy. But this is not about creating a new party or advocating for the merger of organizations that are already there. We have to think of a left politics that emerges from and that corresponds to the class structure in the current phase of neoliberalism, and that correspond to the current mode of existence of the working class. It's not about repeating what Lenin said and what is to be done. It's not about reading more Stalin or Trotsky or Mao, even though they are and will always be essential. This is about developing political practices that can help to overcome the fragmentation of the experience of class in the workplace, across workplaces, across countries, within our communities, between them. So just like a production and accumulation and consumption under neoliberalism, they cut across borders and regions and ethnicities, and neoliberalism then uses those lines to create divisions that then will weaken everyone. The task of the left is to build bridges and to create unity in diversity. In the short run, as far as the pandemic goes, the left can highlight that in contrast with the neoliberal discourse, that there's a choice to be made between herd immunity and lockdown, or maybe you want to stay somewhere in between. We can say that there is no dichotomy because the economy cannot function if people are unhealthy. We can say that capital fetishizes the economy and instrumentalizes people to exploit them, and this, I think, has an immediate appeal. And we can stress that there is no dichotomy between democracy and efficiency. You might remember the early days of the pandemic, the mainstream media and the government said that the UK could not control the virus as China did because we're a democracy and they are a dictatorship. But the outcomes in different countries show that there is no trade-off. Countries have performed more or less well depending on their public policies and not their political regimes.
That should be everybody back in the room now. Thanks for participating in the groups. We're now going to move on to the Q&A, which will end about 9:30, because we know it's 7:30, sorry. We know everyone's got responsibilities and things, so we'll do our best to keep to time. If I could ask everybody who was nominated in their group to virtually raise your hand by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen under the list of names, where there's a button that says raise hand. If you could press that, then once you've done it, I'll add you to a stack and I'll lower your hand. Once I lower your hand, then you'll know I've seen you, and I'll call you when it's turn to speak. I'm going to take questions in threes, if that's okay. If people could just be semi-succinct, that would be great, so we can get through them. And if, just once again to remind everyone that your mic is muted until you unmute yourself to speak. So if the groups could, I will start with Lewis Akers, then Shruti SU, and then Donald McPherson. Lewis.
Thanks very much for that really interesting talk. We had a really good discussion in our groups. We had a sort of transnational flavour to it, so it meant we had a good sort of discussion on both sides of the pond. Our question or our discussion sort of led us to discussion definitions of crisis, what crisis means and looks like. So we're wondering if you could give us a brief definition of what a crisis exactly looks like, what characteristics we would expect to see, because many left groups say that there's a crisis without there possibly being a crisis, and how those new organizations that you mentioned relate to those crises, and what those sort of organizations would look like in relation to those crises.
Can we have Shruti SU? Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for that. It was, I think in our group, it was a lot to digest, and we'll probably need more time to process everything that you've said. We were wondering, since you mainly mentioned the economic and the political crisis, we were wondering how you would situate the neoliberal politics in a socio-cultural space, mainly because you also spoke about political correctness and how that has been weaponized by the neoliberal right. So, and that's not particularly happened through force alone, it's also happened through consent. So if you could respond to that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Shruti, that's a great question. Donald McPherson.
Hi there. Yeah, no, thanks very much. We had a really good discussion in our group. It was a really interesting talk that you gave. Our question kind of features around that kind of idea about the rise of authoritarianism, and in particular to kind of Western Europe. And we only mention that specifically because Western Europe's often treated, and I speak, like France, Germany, these kind of places, it's treated as a little bit different maybe from America or from around the world, as a kind of more slightly liberal place. And how do you think that authoritarianism will start to manifest in, kind of more stable countries, if you can say that? And how do you feel that the role of technology will play in that? How do you find that will develop or be used for that purposes?
Thanks, Donald. Those are three great questions. Alfredo, are you happy to jump in now?
Sure, thank you very much. These are excellent and very, very thoughtful questions, and I cannot give you good answers. I'm sorry. A definition of crisis within economics, or an economic crisis, is a disruption in a sufficient number of individual circuits of capital that the reproduction of capital as a whole becomes compromised. Now that's a loose definition, and ultimately within a Marxist political economy framework or within a neoclassical economics framework, it boils down to definitions. If the economy contracts over two quarters, you have a crisis, but that's purely arbitrary. It depends on how you measure and so on. From a Marxist perspective, it's a more intuitive thing. Has the economy been destabilized enough that capital accumulation becomes difficult by some criteria. So it is intuitive. And if we look at but I think it is more useful if we look at the bigger picture, the longer term, and the contradictions and tensions in the process of accumulation and restructuring itself. So the moment of crisis becomes less important in this way. Now, Marxists are criticized for predicting or predicting 15 of the last 3 crises or things like that. The other side of the coin is that neoclassical economists predict 0 of the last 15 crises. So political economists are very sensitive to disruption because they are focusing on dynamics, contradictions, and change. Neoclassical economists do not see crises because they are focusing on equilibrium, balance, and they have this intrinsic faith in the stabilizing properties of the capitalist economy. So there's a difference there, and the definition will always be a little bit abstract. In terms of politics, I think we could use a similar concept when the reproduction of the structures of representation through the political system becomes sufficiently so disrupted that the system itself doesn't work anymore, then you have a crisis. But once again, it is a loose definition that has to be applied carefully and thoughtfully in different contexts. Social and cultural spaces. I think the angle that I would take to look at this is 1968, and it's the rise of individualism in Western culture in particular. Now that has inevitably 2 sides to it. From the point of view of human liberation, it's very, very important. Individuals have to feel fulfilled, recognized, validated for who they are. And that is a great impulse that comes from 1968. So whatever your characteristics, you want to be validated as a person just like everybody else, and that's an important thing. The negative side of this coin is the idealization of the self, and then the extreme individualism that, particularly in the United States, becomes attached to platforms for liberation, micro platforms that demand or that exclude everybody else and demand absolute recognition of somebody's complaints. That is not very constructive because it builds division. So the left has to navigate these straits between promoting the recognition of each individual and the liberation of individuals from systemic constraints, but without falling into the trap of the ever more minute identification of people to the exclusion of other people, which would be destructive for any left program. And you're absolutely right. It's not just about force, it's about consent. And neoliberalism navigates these 2 things. So it is very much in the sense of my rights to X, have guns or whatever, have whatever strange beliefs I might have. But on the other hand, they navigate the constraints of the body. Who does the female body in particular belong to? And that has been a difficult process, even for the most neoliberal individuals and countries. So again, it's an ambiguous and difficult thing to summarize. Rise of authoritarianism in Western Europe. The case of, in particularly France and Germany, the case of Emmanuel Macron is very clear. Emmanuel Macron is a centrist politically, but he's also intensely authoritarian. His impulses are highly neoliberal in the economy and highly authoritarian in the political domain. What he cannot do is implement his most base instincts, because France has got strong social organizations, a strong left, and a tradition of rebellion. So Macron has been contained over time, and he has fumbled his way through trying to navigate mass resistance. But it is a difficult predicament for the left in France as well, but they are in a much more fortunate position, in a much stronger position than in the UK, for example. Case of Germany is quite different, but the rise of the AfD has been lamentable. It's an absolutely abject political organization, deeply, profoundly racist in its constitution and raison d'etre. and it poses serious constitutional problems for Germany. But Germany is a country with a very strong democratic set of institutions and very, very strong community life and organization. And I have actually more faith that Germany will be able to navigate the challenge of the far right than Britain itself, where the far right colonizes inside the state, particularly with its gang of Brexiteers in power. Role of technology is once again very ambivalent. Technology can be, of course, a tool for liberation in so many ways, but it has also been heavily colonized by big capital. Most of you are not old enough to remember 20 years ago the debates around the internet. The internet was advertised by the left as a free space that transcended divisions and unified people, and it was completely colonized by commercial capital with advertising, and then by Google and by a whole set of large companies that dominate the space of the internet. So it does offer still spaces for liberation and for dissent, but they are heavily guarded, heavily policed, and of course everything you write or say is intercepted by GCHQ and by the US equivalent services. Social media has become increasingly important also for mobilization, and that has a tremendous potential. But it is, once again, there are two sides to this. It can bring people together. You find friends all over the world. You can keep in touch with people and exchange ideas with people on the other side of the planet that previously was just impractical. But the social media also promotes division. And as the events in the United States are showing, you have to be together to be able to change the world. You have to be in the same space. You have to build a community of feeling with fellow citizens who are marching together with you, and you look at them and you trust them. You trust that they will not scatter, that they will be there with you. And the collective makes the strength of the movement as a whole. And this may or may not be promoted by social media. So there are different angles to this. And this is not even to speak, and I'll stop now, it's not even to speak of Cambridge Analytica and its descendants that suck in our data and turn that into commodities. And that is extraordinarily dangerous. And it warrants a big campaign of regulation of these types of companies. And I was very happy to see in the last couple of days the rebellion within Facebook itself. And that is very, very important and very, very good. And hopefully we get some traction this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. Next, we've got Gregor Clooney, Tamara Paulson, and Gregoris Iannou. Gregor, could you kick off, please?
Thank you, and thanks so much, Alfredo, for joining us this evening. In our group, we decided upon the question, how do political movements as episodic and fragmented expressions of discontent in the neoliberal context, how do they support the renewal of progressive political organisation, bearing in mind your directive, Alfredo, that we start from the present composition and mode of existence of the working class? And the two dynamics that we discussed as underpinning the question were firstly, the kind of demonstrated contradictions of the impact of neoliberalism on the ideological and organizational logics of movements. So this kind of dissolution of collectivism into individualized and performative practice. And secondly, our kind of recent experience of the lasting political impact of movements as being simply to kind of shift the balance of power within and between competing fractions of the existing political establishment, rather than creating anything new. So the kind of experience whereby the student movement relegated the Lib Dems to the periphery of British politics, but what we got was a Tory majority. The independence movement creating a mass electoral bloc for the SNP, which has become increasingly centrist, and further back, the anti-war movement in Britain kind of torpedoing New Labour, but just throwing us into the hands of the Tories. Thanks.
Thank you, Gregor. That's great. Now, Tamara Paulson.
Hi. First of all, thank you. This is awesome. we were talking more about how we organize for a just recovery, especially post-COVID. And we discussed education, and we discussed trade unions. And I think what the big question ended up being is, how do we have a grassroots approach to reaching people who have been sort of duped by neoliberalism? Because as you were mentioning before, social media is great for bringing people together, but it also allows for echo chambers. And I feel like we're all here and we're all in agreement, but how do we reach people that won't necessarily understand our point of view? How do we reach them?
That's fantastic. Thank you. And then last we've got Gregoris.
Yeah, hi, Alfredo. In the last part of your speech, you talked about the current crisis being the biggest in the history of capitalism. If that is indeed the case, and will show very soon, and there's lack of prosperity ahead, and with all the mass unemployment and the social distancing that is due to stay with us, at least in the next years, in one way or another, how can collectivism and the solidarity politics come about? Because there could be the possibility of having a further regression into conservatism, alienation, people turning onto themselves, inability of having ability to challenge workers, to challenge their employers in conditions of mass unemployment and so on. So I want you to elaborate a bit on that, on the consequences of the specifically of the COVID and the lockdowns and so on.
Another great round of questions from Gregor, Tamara, and Gregoris. Alfredo?
Okay, this is again fantastic and very, very deep questions. We could spend a long time talking about each one of them. I think they have several points in common, and I'll respond to them perhaps together by giving one example. In my own personal experience, the biggest social movement I've ever been part of was the Campaign for Democracy in Brazil. I'm from Brazil originally, and the country was governed by a military regime until the mid-1980s, and there was a mass campaign for democracy at that point, and we won. So this is already, as a parenthesis, it's already a difference between my own personal experience and the personal experience of people even older than me in this country that have only the experience of defeat at the political level. We did win, not everything we wanted, but we won something. And there is a transformation. You perform your functions as a person of the left, and you try to convince people, and you talk to many people, and you try to organize, and you sell your party newspaper, and you go to places and you knock on people's houses, etc. But something happens at a certain moment when the mass takes over the process and you do not control it anymore. And that is the magic that I imagine would be the revolutionary moment. That ours never got to that point, but it got to the point of spontaneous mass activity when no organization would be in charge. The notion that the Bolsheviks were in charge of the Russian Revolution is laughable because you're not in charge of the process. You try to navigate a crazy horse that you can barely influence, much less control. And you can, if you are in a favorable position, to use the analogy of the Bolsheviks again, you can steer it in particular directions, but you do not control it, which is the reason why I think to attribute the Russian Revolution or to call that a coup is a profound mistake. In our own case, all the left organizations that were active at that point in time lost track of what was going on. And I think that is the quality change in a lot that is touched on in several of the questions. You are operating in a relatively small scale. You basically know who you can count on. You basically know who will turn up for the demonstrations that you expect, etc. And at a certain point, and perhaps in this country, my last memory of this is the anti-war movement, for the big demonstration at the end, you lose control. Then the mass of the people becomes the main actors. And then our role is to try and influence through our ideas and our experiences, but really there is a bigger social process going on. And that is the process that we have, I think, to try and fertilize at this moment in time. And we can only insist, and we can do our best, and that's all that we can do. Throw our ideas out there to wider and wider circles. We're fertilizing the terrain. And at a certain point, it may happen. It may not happen, but it might happen. And when that happens, we surrender control of the narrative to millions of people who will become actors in the process. And this is exactly what we want. Because we don't want to replace the capitalist state by a bureaucracy. Nowhere near even thinking about this. But we don't want that. We want mass participation and proactive protagonism by tens of millions of people. We want meaningful contributions by vast numbers. And again, at this point in time, we are nowhere near that. The grip of neoliberalism in our own minds is very strong. The notion that we can think differently and we can imagine a different society, that is not here yet. And part of the job of the left is to advocate for some concrete changes in the social, economic, and political system that can inspire people. And because people will not mobilize just against something, they will mobilize in favor of something else much more strongly, much more actively. We've got to have a dream, and a dream that we share. And that can be whatever it will be at that particular point in time. And our job as people of the left, activists, etc., is to try and fertilize the terrain and see what comes up. And it's similar with forms of organization. We cannot even think about a small Bolshevik type organization becoming the vanguard of the working class and seizing Buckingham Palace. It's not going to happen, because that type of political organization does not correspond to the form of the working class today. The type of political organization that corresponds to the working class today is emerging. But it is emerging, and we have been successful, and the proof is in success. The proof is in the Sanders movement in the United States. The proof is in the Corbyn movement in this country. The proof is in Syriza. The proof is in the Workers' Party in Brazil. They all lost out in the end, but they showed what is possible. They showed the depth of indignation, the depth of unhappiness, the depth of revolt, in the search for something different, something new, away from neoliberalism. And once again, our job is to try and articulate those hopes and feed it back and try to see if people respond, if they get the idea. But ultimately, my belief is that it will be something unexpected that will trigger mass mobilizations. What happened in the United States is not unpredictable, because it happens all the time. But this time, it triggered a massive convulsion in US society. And I hope it may last. And I hope it will achieve changes. And maybe something similar can happen in the UK, or maybe it can happen in Scotland as well. So neoliberalism, we do have to transcend individualism. We do have to transcend our narrow horizons, but we can't do that alone. And a lot of this does not depend on us coming up with a clever slogan or with some magic formula or whatever. We do our best and we keep working, and something will happen. And all we can do is be there. Just be there, and again, continue to do the best that we all can. And collectivity builds itself. We don't build it. It builds itself. And it can be inspired by something that you say or something that you do. But it will not happen by magic of a group of activists. It just won't.
Thanks, Alfredo. I'm aware that we're running over time a little bit. We're going to be about 5 minutes late, but I think this is a really important and interesting and necessary discussion. And we've still got Sarah Bennett and Callum Murray. Sarah, if you could kick off, please.
Yeah, hi. And thanks, Alfredo, for a really thought-provoking introduction that, like other groups, has sparked lots of questions that I'm sure can go further. First of all, a quick observation is that we were surprised there was no explicit mention of the ecological crisis in your introduction, and perhaps you could briefly mention that. But our main question was, today we've heard the news that the UK government is set to spend over £1 trillion in spending due to the COVID crisis. And obviously that does not fit with the neoliberal financialisation of everything model, or at least on the surface it does not seem to. So the question that came out is, do we think that in this stage of neoliberalism that governments could still perhaps try to revert to more Keynesian modes of economics, even if it's short term, to sort of bail themselves out politically? In the meanwhile, I mean, our thoughts were just quickly that would seem probably impossible given the scale of the crisis we're facing. But on the whole ecological question, we've heard of green capitalism, green jobs, etc., etc. So these things can kind of all get wrapped up into a capitalist mode as well. Anyway, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
So Sarah, your first sentence was that I did not mention a crisis, and I missed the word.
Ecological.
Ecological, okay, thank you.
The ecological crisis. And now Callum Murray.
Hiya. I'm actually going to concede my question because Tamara had asked pretty much the exact same question that we came to, and Dr. Saad-Filho answered it pretty well. So I'll leave that.
Thanks very much, Callum. All right, Alfredo, well, that's just Sarah's question and concluding thoughts.
Ecological crisis, I absolutely, entirely, completely agree with you. But this is such a massive topic in itself that it wouldn't be possible for me to talk about that and the pandemic in particular at the same time. But absolutely, that is the problem. And if we cannot resolve the pandemic in a progressive way, then honestly, I don't really have much hope that we'll be able to address the ecological crisis, and then we are truly, truly extinct. And I think this is now. We are in a situation of runaway climate change. I have no doubt about that. And this is going to end very badly very soon. I did think that I wouldn't be around to see it, but I am planning to be around for some time, and I do think that I am going to see this, meaning it will happen quite soon, and it will be ugly. You know, the UK government will spend as much as it can to salvage capital. It will let people starve, and it will not look after the health system, as has been abundantly demonstrated by their staggering incompetence throughout this process. The UK government has done not one single thing right throughout this entire process since the beginning of 2020. But they will save capital. And they will revert to Keynesianism, and they always do that. In a crisis, everybody in government becomes a Keynesian, and they come back as soon as they want to come back with their old neoliberal discourse, because it's not about intellectual coherence. This is about political opportunism, and it's about power. It's how you're going to use the tools of the state and the tools of ideology to keep your powerful position at the top. They will bail themselves out, and they will cut people loose. And this is what they have done repeatedly with a degree of transparency that is almost laughable, but it is also catastrophic. This government in the UK is responsible directly for tens of thousands of deaths, and this cannot be forgiven. It cannot be forgiven. It is an absolutely mind-boggling combination of staggering incompetence and deliberate will to pursue policies that will kill people. And this did not have to be this way. We just have to look at New Zealand. We look at Germany. We look at Taiwan, South Korea, and then China and Vietnam, my favorite country at this moment in time, a country with a per capita income 1/10 of the per capita income of the UK. Neighboring China, and they have had 0 deaths with COVID. It shows that what is possible to achieve if you are purposeful, and if you have an integrated state apparatus, and if you haven't hollowed out your health system, and if you haven't sold out everything that you could, and if you're not procuring equipment and expertise in the private sector all the time. It is absolutely unbelievable. So yes, we do have to address this. And the demand, I think, has to be very, very high on the government really put their feet to the fire, but knowing also between ourselves that if we fail to do this, we will not be able to address the environmental crisis. And that will be much worse than what we're seeing now. I think the good times for the human race, for the human species, may already be over. And we have now the challenge of rescuing it. And we're going to come out of this in a progressive way, a radically progressive way, or we are not going to come out of this, I think. But then this is me speculating. Thank you so much for the questions. They were amazing. And thank you so much to Alice and to Conter for the opportunity to come and talk to you. I'm really happy today.
Thank you from everybody. A massive, massive thank you, Alfredo. That was an extremely interrogative, thorough, and insightful presentation. And I know that you shared some work which is new, and we feel really, really privileged to have the opportunity to engage with your ongoing work. It's been fantastic, and this will be ongoing, and we'll probably have you back, I hope, in the future. Thank you to everybody there at home, wherever you are, for coming and spending your Thursday evening with us again, or for the first time. It's been brilliant to have you. We are now, for those that maybe aren't aware of Conter, you can find more information about our previous lectures and our future lectures on the website, conter.co.uk. We also have a podcast where you can listen to it on Spotify and Apple, and it feels awful, you know, kind of sharing these techno giants, but that's where we are at the moment until we create our own. And you'll find the recordings of all the lectures there and discussions on contemporary politics and culture hosted by Kat Boyd and David Jameson, who are Conter editorial board members. You'll also receive an email from us this evening with links to a WhatsApp group where you can get an early entry to next week's talk by David Harvey, which will be fantastic, on Marx and the crisis. We've got that WhatsApp group, but you can also follow us on Twitter. It's Conter, C-O-N-T-E-R, and on Facebook. And yeah, we just want to say a massive thank you again. Thanks for keeping on joining us. And if you've heard about us, giving it a chance. Keep safe, keep involved, and I hope to see you all next week. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.